Okay, good morning, everyone. Good afternoon, sorry. It's noon already. So quickly the morning has passed, yeah. Now, welcome to Beyond Net Zero, Tackling Climate Change Through Climate Positive Action, a transformative webinar that delves deep into the pressing issues of climate change and sustainability. I'm your host, 𝗕𝗲𝗄𝗵𝗵, the CEO of Smart Investor Malaysia, and I'm thrilled to guide you through this enlightening conversation made possible by Kexxel Group in conjunction with Evolve 2024. Yeah? Today, we are honored to have with us an esteemed expert and thought leader in the field, Mr. Ian Monroe, a true pioneer in climate solution investing, with over a decade of experience teaching at Stanford University and a remarkable track record of working on energy, climate, and sustainability projects across the globe. Ian brings a wealth of knowledge and insight to the table. Yeah, as the co-founder, president, and chief sustainability officer of 𝗖𝗵𝗶𝗺 Capital, the driving force behind the 𝗖𝗵𝗵𝗺 ETF and groundbreaking decarbonized index strategies, Ian has played a pivotal role in decarbonizing over $100 billion in assets. So today we have Ian with us, and we are going to. I'm sure you all are not here to see my face, yeah. So you're here to see Ian's face. So let's welcome Ian, and I'm going to leave it to Ian from here.
Thanks so much, 𝗕𝗲𝗄𝗵, for the very kind and generous introduction. It's really a pleasure to join all of you, and I'm happy to share some of what I've learned in the course of working on climate solutions, really my whole career. And then I'm really excited to have time to engage in some hopefully quite interactive and maybe even thought-provoking Q&A. So I have a lot in my slides here. I'm gonna go through them relatively quickly, and I won't cover everything that's on every slide, though I believe we will be sharing a recording afterwards, so there'll be an opportunity to revisit the slides. And I'm talking from a few different hats, and I should also give credit where credit's due. A lot of what I will be talking about is from a new textbook that I published with a co-author, 𝗕𝗲𝗄𝗵𝗵, who together we've been teaching courses on solving climate change at Stanford University for years, as well as taught at other universities like University of California, Berkeley, and Harvard as well for John. John's also written a number of books on climate solutions and is really known as a global expert, particularly in decarbonizing the technology sector, ICT and data farms, et cetera, in particular. So this is really a culmination of our learnings from working on climate solutions around the world and teaching cumulatively for a couple decades climate solutions, and actually working on implementing those climate solutions. Both John and I joke that we are pracademics and that we enjoy teaching and researching, but we really, with most of our time, spend our focus on scaling up climate solutions. I've been, as mentioned, working on scaling climate solutions my entire career for over 2 decades now, originally as a climate scientist and engineer, then in the context of international development policy work with governments, with companies large and small, with nonprofits in over 30 countries around the world. Got invited to come back and start teaching at Stanford, launched the first tech company to track personal climate impacts and turned that into a social game. And out of that, we found a strong relationship between the climate efficiency or lower climate pollution per dollar invested for companies and overall financial performance. And that's where I was led into what we now do with 𝗖𝗵𝗄𝗏 Capital on the climate solutions investing side of things, and this larger effort called the Climate Positive Investing Alliance I'll talk a bit about as well. So I'm a strange mix of climate scientist and engineer / policy wonk / technologist on the tech side, and now in the finance world, as well as still in academia as well. And if you want to learn a bit more about what I'll touch on a little bit with this Solving Climate Change textbook, there's more information at the solveclimate.org website for the book, as well as a laundry list of reviews from some of the world's top climate scientists to climate investors and even a sitting US senator. So I'm not going to dive into the science of climate change, whether or not it's real. I hope everybody joining already realizes that yes, climate change is real. It's a huge problem. In the words of my colleague, Dr. 𝗕𝗲𝗄𝗏, we know for certain that climate change is real. It's us. It's really bad. We're really sure in terms of essentially 100% scientific consensus at this point. But most importantly, we still can fix it, and we must fix it. We just really have to hurry, because the longer it takes for us to do that, the more pain we're going to be suffering around the planet. And this is really, at this point, the view of every credible scientific organization around the world, every credible government, every credible publicly traded company. And of course, most everybody now realizes that climate change is real because we are feeling the effects of climate change all around the world. We already are seeing more violent storms, more heat waves, more droughts, more wildfires, more floods, and second order effects connected to climate change like famine, disease, poverty, crime, and even war. And this is happening literally anywhere you look on the planet to a certain degree, and it's only been ramping up. This is data coming out of Munich Re, the reinsurer, and the World Bank looking at climate-related disasters. And you can see that they've been ramping up around the world. And actually, Asia in particular has seen the largest increases in climate-related disasters, both in South Asia and East Asia and Southeast Asia as well. Overall, globally, climate-linked disasters are now 3 times or over 3 times more frequent and severe than they were just back in the 1980s. And really, the projections are they'll be even much worse by 2050 or 2100, whatever date you want to pick in the future, if we don't act much faster and much deeper than we have been doing to decarbonize our global economy. So I know many of our listeners and participants today are based in Malaysia. I'm coming to you now at night from San Francisco, California, which is home for me. In Malaysia, as I probably don't need to tell you, we're seeing climate impacts as well. We're seeing heat waves connected up to now what's probably going to be the hottest year on record this year. We're seeing floods as increasingly frequent occurrence, with just in the last few years, over 600,000 displaced, over $3 billion US in damages, over 50 deaths. And we're seeing increased fires, both within Malaysia and in Indonesia, neighboring countries, contributing to pollution, as well as fossil fuel combustion, which of course is the primary driver of climate change, contributing to additional pollution. And it's estimated that probably conservatively over 23,000 people only in Malaysia per year are dying prematurely because of pollution linked to climate change and fossil fuel combustion. And cumulatively, at least based on one Greenpeace study, that's estimated loss of up to 20% of GDP, again, in Malaysia alone. So if you look at the data, it's pretty clear that climate-linked disasters in Malaysia also are increasing as they are around the world. This is data from the World Bank, from their climate change knowledge portal. And you can see climate-related disasters, which are almost all the disasters on here. You do have earthquakes on here as well, but effectively everything else that's listed on here is linked to climate change in terms of getting worse with more and more climate change. And you can see that since this data set began in 1980, you're just seeing more frequent and more severe climate disasters. So in Malaysia, climate-linked disasters since the 80s again have also increased over triple where they were, and probably will continue to get substantially worse if we don't act a lot faster than we have been. For me, solving climate change is extremely personal. I actually, as a child, would have nightmares that were reoccurring dreams that woke me up at night about the small farm where I grew up in the beautiful valley in Northern California, a few hours north of San Francisco, being entirely consumed by wildfire. And when I was a kid, that was just out of the realm of possibility. We always have had fires here in California as part of our natural ecosystem, but they were small fires. A large fire would be maybe 10 acres, moving at maybe 5 miles per hour. And now large fire is over 1 million acres, moving at literal hurricane force speeds. Unfortunately, this nightmare came true in my community just a few years ago when we were in the middle of one of the huge firestorms that destroyed, as unfortunately my childhood nightmares predicted, our entire valley. A number of my neighbors were trapped, burned to death in their homes. And that was just one of now dozens of mega fires that we've had here just in California. And of course, it's not just here in California. Canada had record fires this year. Australia's had record fires. And there's also record flooding that often goes hand in hand with the fires and can even then cause landslides in all sorts of communities. Really, we're seeing these climate impacts, and no community is isolated. Even Montecito here in Southern California, close to Santa Barbara, one of the wealthiest communities in the world. It's where Prince Harry has decided to settle, along with celebrities like Oprah and a host of others. It's seen devastation from fires and from mudslides. The photos that you're seeing down below there are just a few of the faces that have passed away because of climate-related disasters just in that neighborhood alone. Increasingly, climate change, we're also realizing it's really a tremendous social justice issue. And climate change is really impacting almost everyone, almost everywhere. But of course, those with fewer resources are suffering more and have less to be able to recover from climate change. So Black, brown, indigenous, emerging markets, poor communities are proportionally suffering much more climate loss and damage. And overall, according to the United Nations, it's effectively impossible to achieve our UN Sustainable Development Goals without solving climate change. Climate change is linked to literally every single UN Sustainable Development Goal. It is itself one of the Sustainable Development Goals, but it's connected to every other one. So really, we can't achieve what we want to do in terms of solving poverty and social injustice and biodiversity conservation, et cetera, if we don't solve climate change as quickly as possible. So what do we need to do to solve climate change? Well, effectively, we need to end our pollution as quickly as possible. Particularly, we need to stop burning effectively all fossil fuels as quickly as possible, because that is really the biggest driver of climate change, is burning oil, coal, and gas. And then we need to actually pull out the emissions that are already up in the atmosphere, because if we don't do anything, the climate pollution, particularly carbon dioxide that's already up in the atmosphere, it will stay up there heating the planet for over 1,000 years. And so without our action to actually pull out what's already up there, while also preventing us from sticking more pollution in the air, the planet will just continue to warm. Even if we stop all pollution today or tomorrow, we still have to pull a substantial amount of pollution out of the air to stay within meaningful climate targets as they relate to the Paris Agreement. There's a lot of talk around setting climate net zero by 2050 targets, with net zero being this tipping point where there's enough removal of pollution that it cancels out any new pollution. So there's no new pollution buildup is really what net zero means. But unfortunately, the net zero by 2050 targets that most governments, including here in the United States, as well as most companies and investors are setting, those targets are no longer sufficient. That's effectively what the climate science said about 20 years ago. If we actually started acting and decarbonizing our global economy 20 years ago, net zero by 2050 would have been sufficient to hold within the Paris goals of 1.5 degrees warming. However, at this point, we need to act much faster and cut pollution much deeper and really get to net zero by 2040. And importantly, net zero itself is really not an end goal. We actually need to go beyond net zero to what we call net climate positive, where we're actually removing more pollution out of the atmosphere than we're putting up into it, and returning our atmosphere to the healthy, stable climate that humans and every other species evolved with, which is about 280 parts per million of CO2 equivalent in the atmosphere, whereas now we are well over 400. So quick take home for all of you listening is that net zero by 2050, it's certainly a better pledge than nothing, but it is not actually sufficient in terms of what climate science now says is necessary to solve this huge problem. And it's also important that when we talk about solving climate change, we really think beyond even the stretch goal of the Paris Agreement, which is limiting warming to 1.5 degrees average global warming Celsius. That 1.5 degrees warming is still a substantially worse world than the world that we're in, that's already around 1.2, 1.3 degrees warmer. And I think certainly everyone in my community that's already been devastated by wildfire, and anybody else who's seen loved ones, people in places they love already devastated by climate disasters, we would argue that the climate change we're already seeing is far too much, and we really need to reverse as best we can the damage that's already happened. So climate change at 1.5 degrees of warming is really not a target, it's a limit. We're trying to keep warming from getting there. We actually want to reverse it and effectively get to 0 degrees of warming. And it's a matter of how quickly we can get there. And that really is a matter of how quickly we can get to net climate positive and remove the pollution that's already up there. So net zero is not a goal, it's a transition point, and 1.5 degrees warming also is not a goal, it's a limit. So that's all the bad news. That's where we are with what needs to happen with climate change. The good news, which really is what this Solving Climate Change textbook is about, and what I'll be talking about in November at the ESG 𝗕𝗲𝗆 conference, is that we really do have all the tools effectively to solve climate change already. We can certainly improve them and make them cheaper and develop new tools that are even better than what we have right now. But to solve climate change, we really need to be thinking around 8 pillars of climate action, elevating truth around what needs to be done, electrifying everything we can as quickly as we can in terms of our energy use, ensuring that that electricity is decarbonized, minimizing our non-fossil fuel greenhouse gas emissions from things like deforestation and livestock, ensuring that we're as efficient and optimized in our systems as we can. Again, taking out the carbon pollution that's already up in the atmosphere with carbon removal technology, and aligning incentives at every level to accelerate all these things, from policies that do that at the government level to corporate policies and community policies. And of course, we need to mobilize money to get the money out of investments in pollution and into investments in solutions. So to do all that, I'll go into each of these 8 pillars of climate action really briefly, and then I'm happy to go into further detail when we do the Q&A. So the first is electrifying everything, at least almost everything, as quickly as we can. And already there are a lot of electrification technologies that you're probably reading about. Maybe you're already applying to your own life. Of course, electric vehicles in just the last decade have gone from being something that was a very niche market to now being by far the largest growing segment of vehicle sales. And thanks to Tesla in particular, electric vehicles just are a better product overall. They're more fun to drive, they're faster, they're quieter, they have fewer moving parts. So in general, they're much cheaper to operate, even if they may have a higher sticker price still, but that sticker price is coming down and subsidies are happening. But it's well beyond just electrifying our vehicles. We also need to be making sure that our home energy use is shifting off burning gas to being based on electricity as much as possible in terms of our cooking, in terms of our water heating, in terms of our home heating and cooling. We need to be electrifying our industrial processes as best as we can. ensuring that smart grid technology is enabling the infrastructure necessary to do all this electrification, and using demand-side management technologies to shift loads from peak times at, say, when everybody comes home for dinner, to times when electricity is readily available, say when solar farms are particularly productive or wind farms are particularly productive. In some cases, there's a place for electricity-based fuels, like using renewable energy to produce green hydrogen, ammonia, other synthetic fuels that ultimately are using electricity to then create a liquid fuel for some applications. And the faster that we make our current fossil fuel infrastructure and continued burning of fossil fuels more expensive relative to electrification options, the faster this transition happens. And we're already seeing a number of governments around the world, including here in California, set limits on how long internal combustion vehicles will continue to be allowed to be sold, effectively forcing electrification of vehicles, for example. And you're seeing that for homes here in California as well, where gas hookups now for new construction in many cities, including here in San Francisco, are illegal, which of course forces the transition towards building-wide electrification. And even very difficult to electrify industries, at least those industries that people thought were hard to electrify, like the mining industry, like steel production, like cement production, there now are actually some really exciting possibilities now that are coming to market. Here, one of the big pushes for electrification recently has been around home cooking. In California, it's still pretty common to cook with gas. It's often called natural gas, but I really would call it fossil gas because that's actually what it is. And so there's been a shift towards electrifying cooking through either just things as simple as electric water kettles and single burner induction cook stoves, to fancier induction cook stoves that have batteries integrated into them, so they can also pull from the grid when electricity is plentiful and cheap, and then have a demand-side management piece of what they're able to offer as well. There's smart grid technologies like SPAN that are helping enable this kind of electrification. And one of the themes of a lot of climate solutions is they have a whole lot of co-benefits that go with them. And one of the ones with electrifying cooking is that you also reduce a whole lot of indoor air pollution that comes from cooking with gas, which is actually one of the leading causes of childhood asthma and also contributes to dementia. So now you're improving the indoor air quality in your home while also overall having a more sustainable, better cooking experience for those that are making this transition. Of course, as we electrify everything that we can, we want to ensure that the electricity in our grid is as clean as possible. So scaling up solar, wind, geothermal, and hydro where possible, having energy storage to ensure that renewable clean energy is available 24/7, not just when the sun is shining and the wind is blowing, having a mix of utility scale and distributed generation, upgrading our grid transmission infrastructure to be smart in terms of how it's able to deploy a more varied source of renewable energy. Maybe nuclear fits into the puzzle, depends. It certainly is something that can be quite controversial in its applications. And the more that we price the negative externalities of existing fossil energy infrastructure by pricing pollution, both climate and otherwise, the more that shifts this transition as well. But even without pricing pollution, we've seen, these are cost curves from 𝗧𝗰𝗿𝗃, which does a lot of great energy infrastructure levelized cost analysis that they publish. We've seen in general that solar and wind in almost every part of the world are the cheapest forms of energy already, with zero subsidy. Already they're substantially cheaper than gas electricity, than certainly than coal, and a lot cheaper than nuclear as well. And a lot of places now, even you can combine solar and wind with batteries to have always base load 24/7, 100% renewable energy power, And that is actually coming in cheaper than conventional fossil sources, even without any subsidy. And of course, when you price pollution and or when you subsidize battery technology and renewable energy technology, that only accelerates. But take-home message now is that with zero subsidy, wind and solar just generally are the cheapest forms of energy almost everywhere. And with more and more EVs and other battery applications, increasingly we're going to have cheaper and cheaper second life battery systems where a battery may be too degraded for an EV, but then it can go into grid scale storage. And this is just one company out of Canada that's doing that. There are a number of others. It's not just about stopping our fossil fuel use and transitioning to renewable energy and electrification. Certainly, there are important greenhouse gas emission sources beyond fossil fuels that we should be working to minimize, particularly greenhouse gas emissions from deforestation and from livestock and methane associated with livestock management. Already, there are a lot of exciting plant-based food alternatives and even feed additives that you could feed to cows, for example, to dramatically reduce up to 97% reduction in methane emissions. Of course, the more we can work to stop deforestation everywhere we can and even reforest where some deforestation has occurred, the more we're able to make our land part of the climate removal, the carbon removal puzzle, as opposed to a net source of pollution. There's precision agriculture techniques. There are techniques to minimize contrails from aviation. I actually just came from speaking at a aviation electrification conference here in San Francisco. And there's a lot of exciting material switching, industrial engineering, new cement technologies, for example, that are doing all these things. Efficiency, when we talk about climate solutions, historically, often efficiency is the first thing that's talked about. And efficiency is certainly important, doing more with less. And it's not just about energy efficiency, it's also about material use efficiency all over the place. It's about material switching. You can even think of a switch to plant-based diets as really being an efficiency system in terms of a more carbon efficient way to eat. Efficiency and optimizing processes certainly is an important piece of the puzzle. Of course, efficiency also often saves money and has a lot of other additional co-benefits. Importantly, a lot of electrification technologies also are efficiency technologies. Heat pumps, which are one of the main ways to have both heating and cooling in a building or for water heating, that is much more efficient than technology, than conventional technology. Heat pumps are electrified, but they also are just much, much more efficient. A heat pump, in terms of moving heat, is about 3 times as efficient. It uses 1/3 the energy as conventional approaches. And that's one of just many technologies. Electrification, again, in general, shifting vehicles over to be electrified, shifting even airplanes over to be electrified, ultimately makes the energy use much more efficiently used in transportation. So there are a number of strategies for efficiency and optimization that we won't get into in detail here, but we'll be going into much more deeply at the ESG Evolve conference in November. And I won't dive too deep into this, but it is also really essential, again, that we not just stop the pollution, but we actually remove the pollution that's up there, that we remove as much of the CO2 as we can that's already up in the atmosphere, that again will stay there for 1,000+ years if we don't do anything about it. And it's really important to distinguish long-term carbon removal, where carbon is removed out of the air that's already in our atmosphere and stored for at least 500 years, relative to short-term carbon removal, where maybe agricultural management practices are changed and some soil carbon buildup happens, but that can be reversed extremely quickly within a year or two or less. Or say you improve forest management and then a wildfire burns that forest down. Obviously, those carbon benefits aren't going to stick around. And unfortunately, I've been involved in carbon projects where that has exactly happened. It's also important to distinguish carbon removal from carbon offsets. I worked in the carbon offset space in some of the earliest days of carbon offsetting. I used to really believe in it. Unfortunately, there's been a whole lot of abuse and misaligned incentives in the offset market. So there are some good legitimate offset projects, but a whole lot of the offsets on the market right now are either vastly overstated or effectively entirely fraudulent. And so it's really important to look very, very closely at any carbon offset purchases. And if the price seems too good to be true, it probably is the short answer on carbon offsets. And that's part of why there's been this shift towards paying for much more expensive, long-term, permanent carbon removal, where it's really assured that the price being paid is fully necessary to make the project happen, as opposed to a lot of carbon offset projects where offsets are just one of many revenue streams and there's not a strong additionality case that the price paid actually made any difference relative to what would have happened otherwise. There's a lot of other complexity in carbon removal versus carbon offsets. Again, I won't get into it in detail. Happy to dive into it a bit in Q&A. A couple carbon removal technologies that I'm big fans of that are part of our Climate Positive Investing Alliance. One is called Charm Industrial. They're actually taking agricultural residue, turning it into something that looks like a bio-oil and injecting it under the ground, where that bio-oil effectively is a reverse oil process. It's creating oil ultimately out of the air and putting that carbon back underground for 500 plus years. There's also some exciting enhanced weathering technologies like Project Vesta, which is grinding up mafic olivine material, which then is effectively a sand that they add to beaches to help reverse coastal erosion, while at the same time as it interacts with the carbon dioxide dissolved in seawater, actually decreases the acidity of the seawater, another effect of climate change, unfortunately, and improves local water quality while also storing that carbon in the sand in a, again, 1,000+ year time horizon. And there are a number of other exciting carbon removal technologies. Some are giant machines like Climeworks sucking CO2 out of the air, injecting it underground, other geologic and biologic type pathways as well. So those are the technological pillars of what we need to do to decarbonize our economy and shift it to a net climate positive economy. Of course, it's not just about the technologies, it's about the overall supporting systemic changes that have to accelerate those technologies. And one of the big picture things that has to happen is we just have to get better at aligning incentives, really at all levels. Part of it is incentives at the policy level, be it federal government policy or state, provincial, city policy, or even local policy. Part of it is aligning incentives at the company level, or even just the household and community level. Ideally, we're setting rulemaking frameworks where shifting to technologies that reduce pollution and often have many co-benefits at the same time is rewarded. It's just the easiest, most convenient option. And staying with conventional status quo polluting technologies is less desirable. It's more expensive. It's not socially acceptable. It's more inconvenient. And again, there are a number of strategies to align incentives in different ways. We'll get into at the ESG 𝗕𝗏𝗆 conference, but it's ultimately about just what can be done to align the constant shift towards decarbonization and even beyond net zero decarbonization to carbon removal. And there's all sorts of possibilities, I think, that even we haven't entirely thought about. This is actually one of the spaces where I think there's the most room for innovation, is how can we align incentives at all levels? How can we align job promotion in companies, for example, with achieving decarbonization goals? How can we align government promotion and electability with achieving decarbonization goals, et cetera, et cetera. One of the things that I spend a lot of time is trying to align incentives in the investor world. So with my day job at 𝗕𝗏𝗵𝗵, a core piece of what our team of sustainability scientists works on is looking at the much more complete than generally available climate footprint of about 10,000 of the world's most commonly traded public companies. And important, we look at, in climate geek speak, what's called Scope 1, Scope 2, Scope 3, and avoided emissions for, again, over 10,000 companies. And this means we're looking at not just the direct climate pollution within a company's operations and its electricity use, what would be called Scope 1 and Scope 2 emissions. We're also looking at the climate pollution connected to a company's supply chain, as well as what happens when a company's products and services go out into the world, which can dramatically add to a company's climate footprint. Like in the case of an oil company, most of its climate footprint is actually the carbon embodied in the oil and gas it's putting out into the world, which is kind of crazy, but in conventional climate accounting, that generally is actually ignored. Also, that includes looking at the climate benefits of climate solution companies like solar companies, wind companies, electric vehicle companies, sustainable food companies. And that involves doing calculations of the avoided emissions as those companies are scaling up. So we do these calculations for about 10,000 of the most commonly traded public companies, which means we're getting a much more complete climate footprint than is generally done, often than companies even know about themselves. And we're covering about 85% of emissions that are on average left out of company climate accounting. And if you're not doing the more complete full climate math, you ultimately are not aligning incentives around where investors need to move capital out of problems into solutions because they're not getting a full picture. And you're also not giving companies a complete picture of what they really need to do, how they really stack up relative to their peers. This is just looking at how this more complete climate accounting can change the climate math for different companies. So an oil and gas company like Exxon, when you add on this more complete Scope 1, Scope 2, and Scope 3 accounting, its climate footprint is 6 times worse than it would be in a more conventional climate calculation. And part of the reason those are conventional climate calculations is because the fossil fuel industry has rigged the game that way. So that's another side conversation. On the other hand, a renewable energy company like Vestas, the wind energy company, if you just look at its Scope 1 and Scope 2 emissions, it looks like it still has some pollution relative to its operations to produce its wind turbines. But when you factor in Scope 3 and the avoided emissions for those wind turbines going into the world and replacing fossil fuel infrastructure that would have otherwise been there, it actually is a net climate positive company. It has more benefit associated with every dollar invested in it than it has additional pollution. And so you can add all this up and ultimately find a wide range of climate positive companies and have a more complete climate accounting for companies, which I'll return to in a moment. So a big reason we do this at 𝗕𝗏𝗵𝗵 is just we need to, it's really a subset of aligned incentives, but it is the most important incentive probably is mobilizing money, making sure that we are moving capital as quickly as possible out of climate problems into climate solutions, making the climate solutions even cheaper and better than they already are. As mentioned, wind and solar in most places already are just the best, cheapest options. Very quickly, electric vehicles are becoming the best, cheapest options. Of course, policies that penalize pollution and incentivize deployment of clean technologies only speed that up. And the more we price pollution, the more that speeds that up. The more we ensure that climate benefits are shared amongst a wide range of citizens, the more that speeds that up. The more we push to divest from fossil fuels for particularly public pension funds that continue to be invested in them, the more that speeds that transition up. And there are many other things we can do to mobilize money. It's estimated based on calculations from the UN, a wide range of sources going into it, that on average, we should be spending around 4 trillion right now in shifting to decarbonized technologies globally in our society, which sounds like a whole lot of money. And it is, but you have to compare that to the around 6 trillion that we're currently spending per year on maintaining our current fossil fuel infrastructure and just paying for the cost of burning oil, coal, and gas. If you factor in negative externalities related to the fossil industry, we actually are probably spending over 20 trillion per year supporting our current fossil fuel infrastructure. So with that math, it actually becomes quite clear that it's a net savings in the order of trillions per year in shifting to a decarbonized society. So with 𝗲𝗄𝗵𝗆𝗆, we work on the public equity side of this. We, again, do this deeper climate math. We help construct indexes and funds based on this, and we've advised with asset owners, now helping decarbonize over 100 billion in assets. And our thing that we're most known for at 𝗲𝗄𝗵𝗆𝗆 is our 𝗲𝗄 Climate Leadership Index, which has turned into the 𝗲𝗄 ETF on the New York Stock Exchange. And you can see here that essentially our thesis about more climate efficient companies just being better investments over time generally has played out, where the 𝗲𝗄 Climate Leadership Index and the associated ETF have generally done quite well relative to the overall US market. And we designed this to be a benchmark index replacement to basically mirror what the market was doing, but with our hope that it would perform a bit better over time. And we also apply, I should say, overall ESG screening beyond the climate criteria, where we take out companies with unsustainable business models, in our view, like alcohol, tobacco, weapons, gambling, private prisons, etc., and of course the fossil fuel industry. And I'll give quick shout outs to our wonderful CEO, 𝗪𝗱𝗄𝗏, and our head of research, Wendy Yang, for being key leaders in helping us create this index and just really showing that climate solution investing throughout the economy can go well beyond divesting from fossil fuels to really decarbonizing economy-wide and still look like a pretty darn good investment. Of course, I should make our financial regulators happy by saying past performance cannot guarantee future results, but certainly if you believe in the climate positive future that policies and scientists all say we need, then I am optimistic that this will continue. Our next development for 𝗲𝗄𝗵𝗆𝗆𝗆 I'm really excited about is we now actually have a global net climate positive index, which is substantially decarbonized relative to the most common global benchmark, what's called the MSCI ACWI, or All Country, All World Index. We actually have gone beyond net zero to have something that looks very similar in composition to the most common global benchmark, the MSCI ACWI, where instead of every dollar having pollution associated with it, every dollar actually has net climate solution associated with it. So it's actually a net climate positive index of hundreds of companies around the world that are a mixture of low carbon leaders and climate positive companies, to the point that actually the overall index is not climate positive, and that just launched, and we're now in the process of turning it into ETFs and SMAs and making it more available for investors. Importantly, and this is really a key thing that's bringing me to talk to all of you right now, an essential last but not least pillar for what we need to do globally to solve climate change is really elevate truth everywhere we can around climate solutions, and get climate change education and climate change solutions education, importantly, into educational curriculum at all levels. You're seeing states, for example, here in the US now incorporating it at all levels. And it's really, if taught right, climate solutions are an awesome way to get into almost any academic subject, from international politics and economics to engineering and science. And having a solutions mindset is really essential, because climate anxiety and climate depression is really, it's a challenge. It's something that all ages are now suffering, but there's a lot of studies finding that youth in particular, who are on average much more aware of our climate crisis, they're increasingly much more depressed and anxious about it. So if we're not educating based on solutions and making climate change something that we actually it's a big problem, but we can solve it. And here are all the different ways, and here's how you can help evolve our thinking even more. It's really something that's essential to keep our youth from just feeling too depressed about the state of the world. There's a laundry list of things we can do to elevate truth and, importantly, push against the disinformation, because there is a huge mountain of disinformation at all levels around climate change. And it's been very deliberately manufactured by primarily the fossil fuel industry. And it certainly makes sense, because the fossil fuel industry stands to lose trillions of dollars per year. But really, those are trillions of dollars per year that they're taking from all of us, while leaving tens of trillions of dollars per year as lasting damages that we all are suffering. So figuring out how to push back against all the disinformation, even making it illegal and penalized in different ways. Again, there's lots of strategies. We don't have time to get into them right now. This, unfortunately, is just a quick view of how successful the fossil fuel industry has been in muddying the waters around climate change. So almost everywhere in the world, this is a huge survey of over 70,000 people that Facebook did in conjunction with the Yale Project on Climate Communications in the largest economies in terms of climate pollution, with the exception of China, because, of course, Facebook is not in China anymore. And I put the big red arrow there on Malaysia. For those of you curious, you can see the response there relative to other countries. The correct response is that climate change is caused mostly by human activities. And in many countries, less than half of people, in Malaysia, at least in this survey, it was around 30%, understood just that basic science reality. A question in the survey I left off this slide is climate change happening? And in every country, effectively, over 90% say yes, because we're experiencing it now, because of all the climate extremes I talked about early in the presentation. But still, there's a disconnect between understanding that climate change is happening and understanding that it's us. It's our pollution that's causing it. And the scientific consensus has been there close to 100% for decades now, but public understanding still is not there, primarily because of all the disinformation that's frankly, corruption linked to the fossil fuel industry. And in terms of what we need to do about climate change, if you don't fundamentally understand that it's our pollution that's causing climate change, it makes it hard to understand one of the core truths about solving climate change, which is to solve climate change, we effectively need to stop using fossil fuels entirely. And this is a survey question getting at that understanding. The correct answer here, effectively, based on all the scientific consensus, is we need to use much, much less. It's really close to zero fossil fuels to solve climate change. And again, in almost every country, less than half of people understand that. In Malaysia, at least in this survey, it was 14%. And so just elevating that core truth that we can't solve climate change without dramatically reducing our fossil fuel use, if not getting it entirely to zero, is one of the key things that we need to do to get through the disinformation that unfortunately is still muddying the waters of public perception. Another key thing that's quite interrelated is just elevating the understanding that the fossil fuel industry, even not including climate change, is simply killing us. Based on research from the Harvard School of Public Health and a number of other top scientific publications over the last few years, conservatively, it's estimated that every year fossil fuel burning kills over 8 million people just because of direct air pollution alone. And that including mortality and morbidity linked to fossil-funded oppression, wars, inequity, fossil petrochemical-linked cancers, other plastics pollution issues, other pollution-linked petrochemical diseases. And here in California and many parts of the world where wildfires are now many orders of magnitude bigger, just wildfire smoke alone has reduced all progress that we've had since the Clean Air Act was enacted in the US back in 1970. So that is yet another thing that is climate change linked, that then is also causing probably millions of additional deaths. But the good news is as we electrify, as we stop burning fossil fuels, we will be saving millions of lives in addition because of reducing all this pollution. And these co-benefits are really tremendous. Right now, the fossil fuel industry, again, not based on some crazy NGO analysis, based on the Harvard School of Public Health, peer-reviewed medical research in world's top medical journals, fossil fuel industry is linked to 1 out of every 5 deaths worldwide, conservatively. So effectively, by shifting to the decarbonized future, we are lengthening 1 out of every 5 lives, at least. Excuse me. And when you factor in the economics of all this, and we go into detail in the Solving Climate Change textbook, based on numbers out of International Monetary Fund and a number of very credible sources, probably, again, conservatively, the fossil fuel industry right now is ultimately costing the world over $22 trillion per year, and that will be savings for all of us as individuals and for society as a whole as we shift off using fossil fuels. Of course, those of us that have more wealth really have more responsibility to do this. Over half of global climate pollution is linked to the wealthiest 10% of the world. Probably many of you listening on the webinar fit into this. It's actually kind of shocking how what the income range is to fit into the wealthiest 10%. The wealthiest 1% are responsible for about 15% of global emissions. And so those of us, there really is a direct proportion to personal wealth and climate pollution. And of course, particularly for the wealthiest 1%, that's actually an underestimate because that percentage, that echelon of society is having disproportionate influence on company decision-making, policy decision-making that ultimately has ripple effects well beyond direct consumption decisions for that 1%. So it's actually that 1% is close to connected to 100% of emissions decision-making. One of the things we're doing beyond 𝗖𝗵𝗵𝗆𝗍𝗄 and beyond my work at Stanford to really try to push a solutionist community to move money out of pollution into solutions as quickly as possible is this new Global Climate Positive Investing Alliance, which has been going now for just about a year. And we've already become one, if not the world's fastest growing investor movement with over 100 members in over 20 countries and 5 continents. There's more info at positiveclimate.org. We have asset owners from family offices to institutionals to asset managers, from the earliest stage angel and VC investing to late stage public equities like what we do at 𝗖𝗵𝗵𝗆𝗍. We have network and media partners, a lot of international nonprofits working in this space, media, and even starting to have some government partners working in this space. And then we're also trying to really elevate the serious climate solution technologies that are out there. So we have a number of climate solution technology providers, from electric aviation to electrification of cooking to sustainable food and data-related systems, and pretty much the full suite of climate solution portfolio companies. Broadly, our Climate Positive Investing Alliance members support shifting their money, at least those that directly control money as asset owners or asset managers, to net climate positive beyond net zero as quickly as possible, at the latest by 2035, but many of them are already doing it today. And importantly, they're also pledging to not just decarbonize their investments to make sure that their investments still are upholding indigenous rights, diversity, equity, inclusion, and justice principles, and the overall UN Sustainable Development Goals. And we're helping set guidelines and standards. It's a volunteer-led, mission-driven organization, and it's a zero membership fee thing. The only cost is to really be serious about helping move money out of pollution into solutions and be part of this ecosystem and supporting the ecosystem. And if you're interested in learning more, positiveclimate.org is where we have more information. No, we're quite short on time, as I've unfortunately been, I think, a bit too long-winded here. So I'm going to skip through this debunking climate myths. There are many, and it's important to debunk them. Most importantly, it's just important to remember that another world really is possible. We already have most of the solutions we need, and we will have tremendous co-benefits if we do this climate solution transition right. And really, every job in every part of the world can be part of this. Every household can, and really, in many ways, has to. We have climate solution text checklists for many levels that have come out of teaching the Solving Climate Change textbook, from your home to investors. And at the Evolve ESG conference, we'll be talking about how to actually set up a climate positive plan for a business or for a community, and going through a detailed workshop on each of these 8 pillars of climate action. So with that, apologies for going a bit over time. I say beyond this talk, really think about what are you trying to save in solving climate change. For me, this is the community I grew up in. That's a picture of me when I was a little kid. I now have a 4-year-old who looks quite similar. I want to get back to a community that's feeling safe and protected and just a thriving ecosystem in this beautiful place where I grew up, and I want that for him. And I know for everybody listening, there must be some reason that you are compelled to solve climate change. Some person, some place that you want to protect, and maybe it's just for yourself. Think about that and keep that in your mind as you're motivated to continue to act. So with that, I'm happy to take any questions. Because I've been long-winded, I'm also happy to stick around for maybe 10 to 15 extra minutes and field any questions that come up. So thanks again for having me, and excited to get into the conversation.
Thank you, Ian. That was enlightening, totally enlightening. Honestly speaking, I've had so many questions that I've put down here to ask you and discuss with you, but you've answered majority of them in your slides. Yeah, so it's fantastic, very well done, and I personally learned a lot from it, and I believe that most of the participants here has as well. Now, for all those who are here today, thank you first and foremost for making it. And do note that Ian will be at the ESG Evolve 2023 at EQ Hotel KL. So do attend to have a face-to-face with him. Yeah, we don't have much time today, but you'll have much more time with him on during a face-to-face. Yep. Now, Ian, with regards to what you spoke about earlier, now there was a part that you touched on with regards to carbon offsetting. Yeah? And there was a question that was posted by Felina Ali. Yeah, she's asking if you could explain how is carbon offsetting often fraud? Because in Malaysia, Bursa Malaysia has recently set a platform for carbon trading. What are your thoughts on that as well?
Yeah, so I'd say, unfortunately, the biggest problem with the existing global carbon offset markets, particularly the voluntary markets, but you're seeing this in some of the regulated markets as well, is a problem of what's called additionality, which is fundamentally, would something have happened anyway, whether or not there was a carbon offset price paid for that thing? And in many, many cases, that additionality test really hasn't been done very thoroughly. For example, there are now, it's been exposed that a number of nature conservation nonprofits have sold carbon credits for forests that they've been conserving for, in some cases, for decades. And to sell those carbon credits, they have to sign off on a additionality certification saying that they would cut down those trees if they weren't paid a carbon credit price, even though these nonprofits, based on their mission, are required to preserve forests and already own this land, again, in some cases for decades. So that's probably the single biggest challenge for carbon offsets, is that many, many projects are selling credits just as kind of icing on the cake for things that they're doing anyway. And I've lost count of the number of pitches that I've gotten, even from startup companies that have carbon offsets as part of their model, but they will assure me, hey, don't worry about whether or not I can sell these offsets at this price. That's effectively icing on the cake. I'm going to be a viable business anyway. But that basically is an admission to, well, those offsets are effectively fraudulent. There are other problems with existing offsets beyond additionality. I'd say additionality is the biggest one, but other problems are permanence and leakage. Permanence, for example, if you're conserving a forest, improving forest management, how long do those changes actually last? And I've been involved in helping certify improved forest management carbon offsets that then ended up being in a forest that went through one of these massive wildfires, in this case in Oregon. And those carbon credits literally went up in smoke overnight. And that's unfortunately increasingly a challenge with any nature-based solutions where climate change, because of drought and wildfire, other extreme weather linked to climate change, the carbon that can be stored in our natural systems is increasingly vulnerable to re-release quite quickly. And that's why part of why there's also been this shift towards permanent underground mineralized carbon storage solutions. And then the final challenge with a lot of carbon credits, and I'll stick in the forestry space, is with leakage. So if you preserve a forest here, how does taking that possible timber production off the market drive further demand for cutting trees elsewhere? And that is something that it's very difficult to fully actually quantify that, but you can do economic modeling to do discounting around leakage and stuff like that. So carbon offsets, additionality, leakage, and permanence are the three major problems, but particularly additionality with a whole lot of the offsets. If you really look at the cost of carbon offsets, those that are done right, really effectively 100% of the economics should be coming from selling the carbon. And there's a lot of opportunity for some nature-based solutions like reforestation, where you're reforesting degraded agricultural land, and that's being paid for, not just the tree planting, but the growing of those trees, because it doesn't stop at planting. You have to ensure that those trees keep on growing and taking up more and more carbon. That is a legitimate nature-based solution, where as long as the carbon price is the main thing making it happen, it can be a legitimate offset. But that's actually a removal. It's a nature-based removal, right? I'll stop at that because I do want to get to more questions.
Sure. Let me throw this question to you, Ian. Now, to what I've noticed, particularly in Malaysia, right? When I speak to a lot of people with regards to ESG, and environment, social, and corporate governance, lots of people do not really understand the whole concept behind ESG. And they can't see the correlations between all three. And in fact, I was at a conference the other day as well, which the topic of the conference was E, S, and G is dead. You cannot put E, S, and G together. It's too much to handle. Now, what's your thought on that?
So the way we think about ESG from the 𝗖𝗄 Capital public equity ESG investing frame is mostly about avoiding bad actors. So we are climate first in that we do this deeper dive quantitative climate analysis, find quantitative climate leaders with this climate leadership and climate positive kind of analysis. But then companies that look like climate leaders, we want to ensure don't have other overall E, S, or G problems. So we just do a lot of our own research looking beyond the most common ESG data sets to find if a company has other environmental pollution or toxics problems, if a company has social issue problems, if they are known for discriminating based on gender or race or other factors. And then we look for corporate governance problems. Is a company, committing fraud or doing other things in terms of mismanagement? So we think of ESG mostly about avoiding risk and just looking at additional factors that really are both about ensuring that our investments are aligned with overall values, but ultimately also just about avoiding companies that have risks that can materially decrease their value for shareholders. And that's our personal view of ESG. Is Again, climate first, but then ESG bad actor avoidance. There are plenty of other views on ESG. I'd say there is legitimate criticism that a lot of the most commonly used ESG data sets really are basically greenwashing data sets where they look at what companies say about themselves and they check boxes if a company is good at putting out glossy sustainability reports, ESG reports, formerly known as SRI reports. And if a company is good at saying nice things about itself, then it gets a good ESG score. With 𝗖𝗄𝗏, we really ignore, we don't entirely ignore, but we don't put a lot of stake in the more commonly used ESG data sets because of that, because they tend to be skewed towards what companies are best at saying nice things about themselves. And that skews particularly towards larger companies, particularly in Europe, that have regulatory pressure to say nice things about themselves, but still may have just as much problems in actual operations. So we try to get at what companies are actually doing, not just what they say, and try to put small and mid-sized companies on an even footing with larger companies that have the staff to do all the ESG reporting and have various NGO memberships and whatnot. So there is legitimate criticism that ESG, if done wrong, is really just kind of a rewarding greenwashing, particularly as sustainability has become such a mainstream concept that at least every company likes to claim they're doing, whether or not they're actually doing it. So ESG we view as a really important tool, again, to screen out bad actors and even find ones that are good actors. And that's part of our thesis around climate efficiency and looking at climate pollution, is it's actually a proxy for overall operational efficiency, which companies are doing more with less, and probably a proxy for just better management decision-making. Companies that are more efficient in their operations relative to their peers probably are run by smarter people who are further thinking and reinvesting in their companies to stay ahead of their competition, as opposed to taking money that should be reinvested and giving out in dividends or doing share buybacks or corporate bonuses. So I think if ESG is done right, it's really about just finding better companies that are better investments. If it's done wrong, it's about kind of meaningless greenwashing. And there's certainly a range of how ESG can be done.
Yeah, and we've seen a lot of that greenwashing happening as well. So it's a little sad to see things like this happen. With regards to what you said earlier, especially with it's not just about the climate per se. It's not just about what is already happening, but it's about removing the carbon from the environment. And I think that is the step that most people are not looking at. They're towards looking towards ESG and making sure the company is ESG compliant and things like that. But what happens beyond that? And how do we get that message out to people that it's not just, it doesn't end there. We've got to remove the carbons from the atmosphere. So how do we get that message out here?
Well, I think having conversations like this anywhere and everywhere that we can, and having conversations with policymakers. Actually, my co-author John 𝗕𝗄𝗎 and I gave a similar presentation to the White House, to the Office of Science and Technology Policy, their White House lead, just a few weeks ago. So here we're lucky to have quite high level access, and whether or not the policymakers are really taking it to heart and paying attention is another question. To me, there's still kind of a frustrating divide in the climate solutionist community between decarbonization and getting to net zero pollution and then the carbon removal side of things. If you look at the climate math science, we need both. There's no way to really get to a healthy, stable climate where humans and every other species can thrive without both ending our additional pollution and taking out the pollution that's already up there as best we can. And we can design financing mechanisms that effectively guarantee that. We can tax pollution effectively out of existence. We can force fossil fuel profits to go towards funding carbon removal. There's also even been some interesting proposals around creating a new currency effectively to help pay for carbon removal without causing direct tax holder costs. So there's a lot of things we can do creatively to create the economic landscape to drive the carbon removal necessary. But we do need, at the highest level, just an overall understanding for policymakers, for companies, for investors, for all of us as individual citizens, that we really need both. We need to both get to net zero, and we need to get well beyond that with net positive carbon removals as well.
Nicely said. Now, with regards to COP27 and COP28, the Paris Agreement was fantastic, and I think a lot of the ESG movement has taken place since the Paris Agreement. But now with COP28, there's been a lot of bickering and a lot of things that's happening. Could you share your thoughts on this, Ian?
It will be very interesting. It's a much longer conversation. We should also talk in January. I'm planning to be at COP28 in Dubai. Many are planning not to attend because of all the controversy with, of course, that being really one of the hearts of the fossil fuel industry, and the person who's responsible for running COP28 being deeply connected to the fossil fuel industry. I do think that it's still worth engaging. It's in any scientist's view, not just my own, and I do consider myself, I think, first and foremost, still a scientist. It's pretty ridiculous that even after now 30 years of these COPs, these big UN meetings on supposedly solving climate change, in the official UN documents, we still don't have in crystal clear text that to solve climate change, we need to stop using fossil fuels. And that's been a major debate. And it's mostly a debate that is a debate because of vested fossil fuel lobby interests, both directly controlling governments and industry influence into these negotiations. There's a pretty fantastic talk that Al Gore gave recently for TED, just kind of talking about his evolving thinking on this, where there was a lot of hope, and I would say misplaced hope, that the fossil fuel industry would pivot and would ultimately see the light they needed to become renewable energy companies instead of fossil companies. It's now pretty clear that that's never going to happen without policy really forcing it. And to a certain extent, technology is forcing it already in some sectors, like the rapid rise of EVs. But it's going to be interesting to see how the momentum from COP27 in Egypt, where I was as well, around climate loss and damage being something that should be paid for, that there already is this tremendous amount of loss and damage from climate change. And my own family and community has felt this very acutely with the wildfire that burned down the homes for myself, my mom, over 24 family members overnight, and hundreds of community members. The compensation for that from the government has been next to nothing, from nonprofits has been next to nothing. And that's in a relatively wealthy part of the world in California. Yeah, well, poor for California, but California relatively wealthy compared with a lot of the world. So climate loss and damage is happening everywhere and not being compensated justly really anywhere. And right now there's a debate about who should pay for that between wealthier countries versus those with fewer resources, which I think is a very legitimate debate. But really, I think what we should be focusing on beyond that is, ultimately who should be paying for it is the industry that has been free riding off their pollution, namely the fossil fuel industry, for its entire existence, and has been well aware of this. The best climate scientists were employed by Exxon over 50 years ago that sounded the alarm on climate change, and then the company deliberately worked to try to put out disinformation to muddy the waters of public understanding for many decades, much like the tobacco industry has done. Literally working with a number of the same PR firms and lobbyists and political corruptors as the tobacco industry. So it's really going to be interesting, to say the least, what comes out of the next COP. But I think we do have momentum around loss and damage conversation, the question of who should pay and whether the fossil fuel industry should be part of that, and hopefully finally explicitly getting into the text of the UN agreements around coming out of COP that we need to stop using fossil fuels to solve climate change. That would be a huge win. I'm not overly optimistic that that will happen in Dubai, but I think the more of us that are really pushing for that, the more chance there is.
Nice. Now, it's interesting that you mentioned about technology earlier. So I'd like to ask you, based on your background in Earth systems science and artificial intelligence being such a unique thing, how do these fields intersect in the context of climate change solutions?
Well, like I was talking about briefly with climate change education, and this is why I think climate change education really should be mandatory everywhere, particularly in the context of not just the nature of the problem, but also all the wonderful solutions that are already out there and those that are on the horizon, is that it intersects with almost every piece of our Earth systems. And the Earth Systems program at Stanford is extraordinarily interdisciplinary. It's has components of the natural sciences, physics, chemistry, biology, ecology, but then there's also mandatory economics components, policymaking components, now communications, elevating truth related components. And really we need every piece. It's not just about, I used to be a hardcore scientist, technologist, but I've increasingly realized you can have the best science and technology, but without effectively communicating to the public, communicating to policymakers, getting the economics right for scale, things won't scale. And in terms of how artificial intelligence fits into everything, I think myself included, nobody really has a great answer. There's a lot of promising, exciting climate solution related things that can be done, just better modeling of our climate system, better communications pathways, better materials design, novel materials design, etc. It also can be a huge additional source of disinformation and misinformation with not just ChatGPT, but certainly, yeah, you can really use AI now to produce videos, to produce audio. You can, yeah, I think just in general, already we have a problem with less trust in information because there's so much disinformation out there. And I think AI is going to amplify that. We'll probably need to, in some ways, use AI to fight AI and try to, filter out the disinformation with AI as well. But it's a very open question. Certainly, I think part of our overall cultural divide has been AI augmented algorithms that feed us information that we react to that reinforces our views. Through social media, through YouTube, etc. The algorithms that maximize our engagement, that maximize revenue for online ad-driven platforms are not the algorithms that maximize elevating truth and overall, better public understanding of what's needed, not just to solve climate change, but for so many global issues, and the COVID pandemic and all the misinformation there as well as another example. So it's an open question where AI fits in, how much it's part of the solution versus part of the problem. Right now, it's certainly a bit of both.
Okay, and Ian, you were generous enough to give us an additional 10 minutes. You've taken 20 minutes of your time. So let me end by asking one final question. Yeah, looking ahead towards the next decade, what are your hopes and aspirations for the climate change movement? And how can collaborative efforts such as the 𝗕𝗲𝗄𝗏 drive meaningful change on a global scale?
Yeah, that's certainly a huge question to get into all the pieces of the answers right now. But I think I really do fundamentally have hope and optimism that we can do this together. And in some ways, the silver lining of climate change is this huge global problem that we all, in some ways, are contributing to, but it also means that we all can be part of the solution. And the more we work together, the more we understand each other, the more we elevate truth around what can be done, what must be done, the more we're ultimately creating an interconnected, more functional global society at the same time. So I think there is that aspect of solving climate change that maybe also just makes us a better global community. There's certainly plenty of things that are tearing apart our global community at the same time, but I have collaborated with climate solutionists really all around the world, including in places where we have sticky relationships. I've lived and worked in China for a bit, for example, and certainly US-China relationships right now are challenging. There still are some really great dedicated people in both countries trying to continue to collaborate. And that's true really around the world. I think that those that have come to understand the urgency of collaboration around climate change, really just understand the collaborative nature of the challenge. And so that's what gives me a lot of hope, is that increased understanding. And as much as the COP big UN meetings can be frustrating for a number of the reasons mentioned and beyond, they also are tremendously inspiring, because you have climate solutionists from around the world descend on to a place and share ideas and explore ways to collaborate well outside of the official UN negotiations. And that's really what brings me to the COPs, these big UN conferences around climate. So I'm ultimately optimistic that we can get there. And I think the more we work together to get there, the better. And really, when I started in this climate solution journey, solar, wind, a lot of climate solutions were still super expensive. EVs were barely even in existence. And now they're just the best, cheapest options almost everywhere. Certainly with solar and wind, but EVs and battery solutions are getting there quite quickly. All these other electrification technologies, plant-based foods also have lots of health benefits, just the understanding of the co-benefits that are out there. So I am tremendously heartened, and this is part of the reason I continue to teach at Stanford and elsewhere. It's just seeing the next generation. And I don't want to make it be the next generation is going to save us thing, because we need all of us in it right now. We don't have time to wait for our kids to save us. We all need to be working on it. But I am constantly inspired by particularly young leaders that have, new energy, new ideas, that are constantly bringing new solutions and amplifying new solutions. So there's a whole lot of reason for hope. I wouldn't be doing this if I didn't ultimately have hope. And I hope that my now 4-year-old, when he looks back at what his dad did with his life, knows that at least I tried my darndest to try to help make this a more livable planet. And I appreciate you and everyone everywhere in your community participating. And I'll just toss out there for any additional questions. Again, apologies for being long-winded. I have this curse as a professor type dude to just ramble on, sometimes much longer than I'd like. But feel free to reach out to me. I'm easy to find on LinkedIn. Send me a note, connect if you have any follow-up questions. I'm really happy to dive into them.
Fantastic. Now, to echo what Ian just said, if you've got additional questions, we can't take too many questions at the moment because of time constraints, but do send the questions to Kexxel Group, and we'll try to get Ian to answer them for you if he's available. Now, according to Kexxel Group, they shall be giving out Ian's deck as well to participants who are here today. So if you're interested to receive Ian's deck, do reach out as well. And also, Kexxel is extending a 5% discount for the upcoming ESG 𝗕𝗏𝗆 2023 conference that will be held on the 21st to 23rd of November at EQ Hotel, Kuala Lumpur. And this 5% is extended to all participants who are here today for this webinar. Now, having said that, Ian, on behalf of Smart Investor, I would really like to thank you. It was a pleasure speaking with you. And on behalf of Kexxel Group, I'm sure that we are all very, very excited to see you in person too when you are here. And thank you so much for spending your time with us.
Thanks so much again for having me, and I'll look forward to hopefully seeing many of you in person soon as well.